Hello and welcome to another edition of Proselytize or Apostatize. I'm your host, David Russell, along with my co-host, David Calvin. How you doing, David?
I was predestined to be here.
Yeah, I saw this old photo of you from back in the 1500s, so I thought I'd put it on so everybody could see how much of a presuppositionalist you actually are.
Yeah. Well, I mean, they didn't even have pre-sub back then, but you know what? We're not concerned with historical accuracy or anything on this show, so yeah, let's roll with it.
Well, yeah, what's really cool, David, is speaking of history, we've got a friend of mine that I met through Skeptics and Seekers, Theodore Pappas. Pappas or Teddy
Pappas.
Pappas? All right, I did say it right. Good, good. She is a practicing criminal defense attorney and has been practicing since 1994. And since December, she's been on numerous Skeptics and Seekers shows. And welcome along, Teddy. We're happy to have you.
Thanks. Great to be here.
Awesome. So, Teddy, we're going to talk about the Shroud, which I don't know much about. And this is like an interview forum, so we're all here just to have fun. If you want to say anything about yourself before we get going, you're more than welcome.
I think you pretty much nailed it. But I guess just one other thing. The Shroud of Turin, I first learned about it when I was 16 years old. It was around Easter time. And I think I saw a little blip about it on the television and a magazine cover, and then I got curious about it, and I went and bought a book on it. And from that point on, it was the book was called Verdict on the Shroud by Ken Stevenson and Dr. Gary Habermas, and it was so compelling that I've always been very, very fascinated by it.
Yeah, I've always, they came out. It was a few years. I think it was probably 2015 when they displayed it again. And I heard Gary Habermas talking about it, and I was like, well, this is intriguing. So, David, he has his own experience with the Shroud. David, why don't you tell us a little bit about your experience with the Shroud?
I don't know about this experience. That was news to me that was coming up. No,
You said
on
that
the
you studied it a little bit with William Lane Craig, had made an argument for it.
Yeah, I read, actually, yeah, I did get the book that she just mentioned, Verdict of the Shroud, and then, but before I got that, I had read about it in William Lane Craig's book, The Sun Rises. He had a chapter where he discussed it there, and it was kind of interesting to me because I had never taken it seriously before. I just heard, oh, that's a Catholic thing, and we evangelicals, we don't have anything to do with that. But William Lane Craig's a respected evangelical scholar, and he was making a case for it. And I was like, all right, this is interesting. And so I wasn't like completely convinced or anything by it, but it opened me up more to it. The book by Habermas was also interesting. Beyond that, I haven't really studied it a whole lot more. So, I'm not sure, at least to me, and maybe we'll get into this in the interview, but at least to me, I was always thinking, even if it is valid, I'm not really sure like what the apologetic value of it is, other than maybe debunking Jesus mythicism. So yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
The apologetic value about it is that you evidence, the most solid evidence possible of a miracle and that God exists, and not only that God exists, but the Christian God exists, because there is evidence on the shroud that the body that it had wrapped was removed from it in some sort of a miraculous way, and so there's evidence of the resurrection on it. Yeah. So I mean that's the most. If you ask me, in terms of what's the most explosive evidence for Christianity being true, it's the Shroud of Turin.
Yeah, Teddy, and you think this is a really cool area where apologists could actually use it to their advantage. I was wondering, have you ever thought about maybe writing up an actual apologetic on it to incorporate into a cumulative case type of apologetic?
I have, and at one point, it was back in December or so, where I started doing a bunch of intense research. I've done research before on the Shroud, I was 16 when I read the book, and then about 3 separate times I had some stints where I was doing for about 3 or 4 days some research on it. And actually, when you ask about the apologetics value of it, a very dear friend of mine who was in his 70s, who was an agnostic all of his life, other than maybe when he was just a little kid, he ended up, we had never talked religion before, and one day we were talking and I found out that he was an agnostic, and I said, well, have you ever heard of the Shroud of Turin? And he said no. And he's a very sharp man, very logical, very savvy with politics and all of this, and he was saying no. And so then of course I get on a tear and I start sending him a bunch of information. But the difference between him and some atheists are he had an open mind. He was just the type of person that he just couldn't do it mostly on faith. He needed science. He needed evidence, and he needed compelling evidence, and I gave it to him, and he's now a Christian. So
Really cool.
That's the power of the Shroud, but one has to be, because there are a lot of people, and actually Christians have been some of the fiercest opponents to the Shroud, which is weird. But there's somewhere that I've read, I don't remember what verse it is, but I was doing some research on apostasy, and in terms of like, what does it mean to blaspheme the Holy Spirit? And they were talking about how it had to, and this was one interpretation, probably several, but this one interpretation had to be, well, when there is clear evidence of the Holy Spirit, to deny it. And so I would caution all Christians, because if that interpretation is true, I would submit that the Shroud is the miracle. It's God's gift to mankind to evidence the resurrection and to evidence his existence. And so I would, to skeptical Christians, I would suggest perhaps to just, if you don't find the evidence compelling, just stay neutral, but I wouldn't, deny it.
Throw the baby out with the bathwater. Yeah.
Like I said, when I read that particular definition, I was thinking, well, gosh, there are a lot of Christians that are just out and out hostile towards the Shroud, and I'm thinking, people, look at the evidence, but they haven't looked at the evidence, and so they just.
So yeah, you're right. There's a lot of people that flat out deny, and I think Clement VII was one of them. But before we get into that, for those that don't know, the Shroud of Turin is the actual, what they call the burial cloth of Christ. And it's what Christ laid in as he was in the tomb for 3 days. It surfaced in medieval France. And yeah, Teddy, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes. Well, Jeffrey,
some of the history.
Sure. Jeffrey de Charny, there's a Jeffrey de Charny the first and Jeffrey de Charny the second, but Jeffrey de Charny the first, he got the Shroud. He got possession of the Shroud, and it's not clear to us, looking at it historically, exactly how he came into possession. He has always maintained that it was given to him freely, that it wasn't something that was stolen, and so it wasn't like a treasure gotten from war, that it was freely given. And many people think, and I would say that I'm included in that, although I haven't completely worked out for sure, and I don't know that it can be worked out, how he got it, but I think a very solid case can be made that he got it from King Louis of France, because when the Crusaders had, during the sacking of Constantinople, there's evidence that this thing that was in Constantinople that was referred to as the Mandelion, that there's a lot of very compelling evidence that the Mandelion, which had been historically referenced as the image that is not made by human hands. And that description applies 100% to the Shroud. And I know that sounds like a very big statement to make, but we're in the 21st century with all sorts of technology, and no one has managed to replicate an image that has all of the striking and peculiar characteristics that the Shroud does, and the Shroud has. And so, you know, if it walks like a duck and it quacks like a duck and it acts like a duck, but you know, when you start getting into just a myriad of different features that are so bizarre and peculiar and that no one can replicate, at what point, you know, does one, and this brings to mind a quote that I love of David Hume, the atheist David Hume, back in I think it was 1778. He had written a book, and inside this book, there was a section dealing with miracles. And he said, no testimony is sufficient to establish a miracle unless the testimony be of such a kind that its falsehood would be more miraculous than the fact which it endeavors to establish. So when we are talking about the Shroud, in light of the fact that when the Shroud appeared in medieval France and there was all the hubbub with the Darcy memo, the Bishop Darcy, about a medieval forger supposedly claiming, and as just like in our the show that we did on slavery together, David, translations can make a whole lot of difference. And so there are some kinks in the translation in terms of whether the forger claimed that he made it, or that the bishop had heard from a forger that he claimed to have made the Shroud. We don't even know whether it was the same Shroud. Anyway, I digress. But so, you know, there was this claim that a forger had created this cloth. And so when you start to break down all of the different peculiarities of the Shroud, if you just look at things logically, and there's a lot of science and forensics and history, all of that merge into this subject, it's not reasonable. David Johnson just always gets nuts when I say that, but I maintain it. I'm sticking to it. I think it is irrational to, when you look at all of the evidence, and you know, for people who haven't done the extensive digging, you know, okay, it sounds like, wow, you know, how can this be? But once you start digging into it, it is compelling. I always say,
so Teddi,
people are going to end.
As a defense attorney,
Mm-hmm.
if you were presented this case for the Shroud and all the various evidences, are you saying that you would get if you were a prosecutor and not on the defense, would you be able to get a conviction?
Yes. And I have said that, I have maintained that. And as a criminal defense attorney, I definitely know what it looks like to prove something beyond a reasonable doubt. And the Shroud evidence, I mean, we were saying that the evidence against OJ during that murder trial was way more than what you see in a typical murder trial, okay? The evidence for the shroud is way beyond that. I mean, there was a serial killer in Tennessee, and one of the he had done a bunch of mass shootings in different fast food restaurants, and with one of the situations, the evidence that nailed him, and I think that it was. No, I just heard this from one of the assistant DAs, so I was not involved in the case. But the assistant DA had told me that the only real evidence they had was his bloody fingerprint on one of the victim's driver's licenses as he was going through. So just one piece of evidence. Now, granted, you can't come up with a logical reason as to why, Paul Reed's fingerprint was on, a bloody fingerprint was on that person's driver's license. But I will tell you, with the shroud, let's see if y'all can come up with some good reasons for the peculiarities. But as I say, people are going with this, when it comes to the Shroud of Turin, people are going to end up believing in a miracle one way or the other. Whether there was some forger that through some miraculous process was able to create a cloth with all of these qualities, or whether the cloth is indeed the burial shroud of Christ, and that has some evidence of it, of the resurrection.
Okay, so yeah, that's really interesting. So what you're saying here is that this forger, from what I read, is that Clement said that he had a confession, is what I read. Did you read any of that?
No, there's no confession on record. The Darcy memo. So all of that stuff about the forger, that is contained within this thing called the Darcy memo. And Bishop Darcy, he was the bishop there in Liry, France. And he was claiming that his predecessor, Bishop Poitiers, had this exchange with a forger. But this bishop was a huge fan of Geoffrey de Charny. They were very, very close. So it wouldn't really make sense that the bishop would be praising Geoffrey de Charny about something if Geoffrey's perpetrating a fraud on the public. But in terms of the forger, all we have, so this Darcy memo, first of all, it's not signed, it's not dated, and in fact, it is just a rough draft. We don't really have evidence that Bishop Darcy even wrote it. It could have been some scribe that wrote it, that was preparing it for him. But then the Pope ended up silencing Bishop Darcy on threat of excommunication. So
yeah, that's another interesting bit of history. There are people that have been excommunicated because of this. I think it was the daughter of the knight that found it or something that sold it to some Italian royalty.
Oh, that was Geoffrey de Charny's, because there was Geoffrey the First, and then Geoffrey the Second, and if I remember correctly, it was Marguerite de Charny. Yeah. She did not have any children, so she had no one to leave it to, and so she ended up. She was very, very close friends with the King of Italy. It's the Duke of Savoy, but it's the king. I don't know exactly how that works, but the Savoy family. She was very close with his wife and with the family, and she knew that by her, and they did sort of an exchange. She ended up getting some land. They got that. But she knew that it would be in excellent hands that she was putting it in. And so, that's how they got it. And at the time of the 1978 tests, when the Shroud of Turin research project, the Americans, and there were some people, some Italians as well, and maybe some other places as well internationally. But it was dominated by the Americans. When they went to Italy and they were analyzing and testing the Shroud, at that time, the Shroud was still in the hands of the deposed King of Italy. So they didn't have to go through the Pope at that time. When they did the carbon-14 testing in 1988, that's when they had to go through the Pope, and it was Pope John Paul II at the time.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. So, Teddy, as a defense attorney now, your idea is to poke holes in stories, and stuff like that. And you're telling me you're having a hard time poking holes in this story, which is really cool to me. And this is why I encourage you to actually write an argument out that is pretty good, that people can read, put all this stuff together. But now, we discussed the history of the Shroud. I want to bring David in to see if he has any questions before we move on to some of these awesome qualities that you're talking about that will make this miraculous. David?
Yeah, specifically, one question I had is, you said we had evidence of somehow Jesus being miraculously removed, right, from it. So I'm kind of curious how do you get to that point? Like, what would be the evidence that that there was a miraculous removal?
Okay, the evidence that concerns that. So, and we're kind of putting the cart before the horse, but I will kind of let you know. Spoiler alert! It is real blood, and it's silliness. Actually, a lot of skeptics regarding the Shroud concede that it is blood, that it is real blood, because there are 12 different tests that the Shroud of Turin Research Project team, and it's called STURP for short, that they conducted. I mean, they see porphyrins in the red stuff that's on the Shroud. There's serum halos on it, just serum albumin, all sorts of things that show that it is blood. There's iron, heme. Anyway, so let's just assume, because anybody doubting that it's real blood, just a little bit of homework. And actually, I can send some things too to read for people who might be interested to see that there's a wonderful, there are tons of papers. And for anybody interested in learning more, shroud.com is the definitive website for that. It is run by Barry Schwartz, who was an original member of the STURP team. He was the photographer. And so anyway, but back to the blood. So let's just assume, because it is blood. So blood, somebody can just get some blood, get a paintbrush, paint it on there. Nope, can't do that, because first of all, when you get liquid blood and you put a paint, whether you drop it on the Shroud, first of all, let's talk about dropping some blood on the Shroud. If you drop a drop of blood on a piece of linen, what's going to happen is you're going to see something that looks like a star, because the blood is going to travel along the threads of the linen. So it's not going to look like a perfect round dot. It's going to look like a star. So you can't just get, and if you get blood, and people have tried this, to paint blood marks on the Shroud, it doesn't look anything like the Shroud. What they have discovered, what these blood marks are, the way they got on it, and what they are, is they are actually transfers of blood clot exudates. And so Jesus, or let's say we don't acknowledge it's Jesus yet, just somebody, some crucifixion victim, they were wrapped up in it. The blood is going to be drying on them while they're on the cross, and then it's wrapped up. So they think that a process called I think it's fibrinolysis, where there's that remoistening of the cloth. But back to your question. So you have these very interesting type of bloodstains, and a Professor Art Lind and Mark Antonacci, who is also an attorney and a Shroud scholar and has written, I think, at least 2 books on the Shroud. They were doing experiments on trying to replicate these blood marks. They couldn't do it. The blood was always drawn, because with blood, you have the issue of coagulation, and that happens pretty quick. And so it's not just getting it on the fabric, it's your supply of blood. Is somebody going to constantly be giving you a fresh supply of liquid blood? And coagulants hadn't been discovered until around the 1700s. So, this medieval forger figured out how to, put an anticoagulant in blood, or did he get dead animals, like a bunch of rodents or something, and put injuries on them and then put the marks? Because we see there's evidence with these blood marks that they were done through a contact process, not painted on. So then when they examine these blood marks, what they also see is that the edges of the blood marks have meniscuses, where it's like a raised edge, and it kind of falls a little bit in the center. Now, it's these raised edges, that's where everything, happens concerning the resurrection. So if you have these raised edges, when you put the cloth on it, what would you imagine would happen? So, people have speculated, because we know there's lots of evidence that even secular historians believe that, in terms of the empty tomb, okay? So we have a shroud, but there's no body in it. Then there's the question of what happened to the body. If we accept as true, in a hypothetical, that a real body was in this shroud, there's the question of, well, so where is the body? Because it's not there. But so then that would mean that somehow either maybe somebody took the body, or maybe the body resurrected. But when there's the question of the body being separated from the cloth in a natural way, where that's not involving the supernatural, here's the problem. When that piece of linen cloth is, because we know that the linen cloth had to touch the wounds, because that's how it got the blood marks on it, and the blood marks go all the way through the fabric. Now, the body image does not. The body image is the most superficial imaginable. It just, on one strand of thread, one piece of thread is composed of hundreds of fibrils. And the body image, that real faint image that we see, that color only goes down 1 to 2 fibrils. That's how superficial it is. But so anyway, so we have these, and the way they found it out is they got like a credit card or something, and they were just able to scrape it, some of the body image off a fiber. But so anyway, so when you lift the linen fabric off of the wound, so now everything's dry, right? So the blood's dry, And we think that through fibrinolysis, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, that there was some sort of moistening of the wound to where it re-wet. There's also some other theories from what Art Lind mentions in his study, and there's a write-up about it on shroud.com, where certain, for example, the hairs on our arms, certain tissue, blood does not coagulate on. And so that could be how it got remoistened. It could have been moisture within the tomb. You know, we're not totally certain how it happened, but somehow these transfers came onto the cloth. Nobody can replicate them. But with these meniscuses, they're all perfect. They are all intact. Whereas if you were to pull the fabric off in order to separate the corpse from the shroud, you're naturally going to pull off some of those edges around, and there are over 100 bloodstains on the shroud. And so you would have some lifting up of the blood, especially with these edges, but all of these edges, they're intact. So then how in the
Teddi,
world
real quick.
Yeah.
So here's my question, and maybe, I want to make sure, David, that you don't have any more, but can a long-term decay do that?
There is no putrefaction. There's no evidence of putrefaction, and that is one of the important elements about the shroud. We see this image on there, and of course, how did it get on there? There's no evidence of putrefaction. And so it couldn't have been, so had it been a some corpse other than Jesus's, again, let's just say somebody removed the body prior to putrefaction kicking in. How is it that the perimeters of all of these bloodstains are intact?
Yeah, that's interesting.
That is where that's just the cherry on top.
Yeah. So, David, does that answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, no, yeah, that sounds interesting there. So then kind of what is the theory, I guess, on what happens is you just think that, because I've always kind of tried to imagine this, because we know that Jesus, after he resurrected, has the ability to, like, go through things, right? Mm-hmm. So is the view that, like, when he resurrected, it just, like, kind of folds up and he walks off of it?
There's actually a theory, it's called the cloth collapse theory, because I've read where they say that the way the image is on there, it's like the cloth was just right in front of Jesus, and like almost like a flash of energy. I personally think that whatever that if you've got a dead body, the energy's gone from it, right? So to resurrect somebody, I would think, God is infusing that body with energy. And given that Jesus was both incarnate but also a deity at the same time, since he never surrendered his being a deity, I would assume that it takes probably an awful lot of energy to reincarnate the incarnate version of a deity, because they still have those godly powers even in their incarnate form. So yeah, they think, some people think that the image, because the other thing with the image, we know that with the blood stains, it was a contact process, in terms of that the shroud was in contact with the bloodstains in the body. But with the image, it was formed in a different way. It was formed through a process of projection. And there's evidence on the shroud that is so, because otherwise there would have been distortion in the image if it was done through a contact process. People have tried doing images where they, for example, they'll get like a mannequin, put blood on them, and then wrap them in a shroud and unwrap it. And, because the body is three-dimensional, the blood marks go, all over the place, but that's not what you have with the body. So,
so David, does that answer everything?
Yeah, that was a question I had. Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah. Any other you got on top of that?
I'm just kind of curious because, again, this isn't something that I've studied a whole lot, but I'm wondering, like, what, I guess, is the biggest objection, would you say, the biggest argument? And maybe not just like a counter theory, but like, is there any maybe problem with it that somebody would bring up, or something that's perceived as an issue with it? What might be the biggest one or biggest few?
Absolutely. And I would say there's a clear winner on that. And that is the 1988 radiocarbon dating results, which put the date of the shroud within the medieval period, which also happens to correspond with this awful Darcy memo. And that's why I have been doing a bunch of research on the memo, because so many people get hung up on that memo, which is not signed, it's not dated, it was never, there's no record of it having been sent to the Pope. And there were actually two clergymen. One was last name Chevalier, and I think the other one was Thurston. Two men of the cloth that did some rather hinky things with that Darcy memo to give it sort of the imprimatur of legitimacy. I think it was Thurston that had ended up kind of putting a date on there or something. I'll have to brush up on that, but I think it was that he put a date on there which kind of made it look like it was part of the back and forth letters that were going on between the Pope and the bishop. And but there's no evidence in the Vatican, nothing. And usually there's a tradition when they issue these, they refer to them as papal bulls. And I think that's just sort of like an announcement. But there is a tradition of when you write one bull, you will reference the letter that it is in response to. So with the correspondence that we see that goes back and forth, there's no evidence of this Darcy memo. So I think that if Bishop Darcy was in fact writing this, I believe that, the Pope's saying, shut it down. And also the Pope at the time was related to the de Charnys. Was it Marguerite de Charny? They were related through marriage. I think the Pope was the brother-in-law of the man she remarried after Geoffrey I was killed. And so the Pope would have, I'm sure, if the Pope is your brother-in-law, I'm sure you've shown him the shroud. So I think that's partly why he was shutting it down.
Interesting. David?
I think that was all I had in the way of big questions. I know we're getting to the point here, so I think I'll turn it over to you then if you have any other questions.
Yeah, so Teddy, there's two different analysis done. One team concluded that, this was created in 1260 to 1390, but the other one said it was 300 BC to 400. And then in 2013, fast forward, we have an infrared test and a spectroscopy, which I've been having trouble saying all the time, that says that it's around 280 to 220 CE. So that those last two actually cover the span of Christ's life. So what is your thoughts on that? Who got it wrong and who got it right?
And actually, I had, as I was finishing up with David's question, the other David, I forgot to get to the whole meat of it, which is how unreliable the carbon dating was. So concerning the radiocarbon dating, one problem with that is that it's always referred to as the gold standard. When I was in college, I had always heard in my chemistry and biology classes that, oh, radiocarbon dating, the gold standard. Well, it is, and usually in most situations, but that is not, that does not mean that it is infallible. And the people who use radiocarbon dating the most are archaeologists, and they are acutely aware of how it's not uncommon at all for radiocarbon dating results to be wrong. And there can be all sorts of reasons, and a lot of times the dating can be massively wrong. There have even been situations where the dating has given a date that's a future date, and that's because of it's referred to as isotropic exchange, to where, depending on where something is that was being carbon dated, it might be picking up carbon from other substances. So, so dealing with the radiocarbon dating, first of all, back in 1988, the type of radiocarbon dating that they were doing, it was a relatively new form that had come into existence that could handle, instead of needing a much larger piece of fabric, because that's why there was no interest before from the Vatican in doing it, because they didn't want to have to sacrifice a big of the shroud to do the dating. But once they could do it with a piece of fabric the size approximately of a postage stamp, they went ahead and did it. So, but this, and it's AMS, I think it's accelerator mass spectrometry. Spectrometry is the newer form of carbon dating that back in 1988. So it was relatively new, and it was not something that was done much on textiles. Now, let's get into first. There's a company called, they're out from Florida, and it's called Beta Analytics, and they are the largest radiocarbon dating company in the world. And if somebody just Googles their website, they can see it for themselves. When you look to see about textiles, guess what they say? They mention that they will not basically date textiles unless it is part of a multidisciplinary process. And what that means is, it's basically what archaeologists see. Sometimes they will be at a site, and there's a lot of compelling evidence that the things that they see at that site give it a certain date. And then they do the radiocarbon dating, and they get a date that's just really off. Well, then they know that something went wrong with the radiocarbon dating, and we'll get into in just a moment what can go wrong with it. But so you've got this issue here with textiles. So we have with Shroud very much so a multidisciplinary process. Things that make it compelling to think that the shroud is what we think it is in terms of the burial shroud of Christ. There is history. There's the Bible. But even more compelling for the skeptic is there's a lot of science and forensics that come into play. Blood spatter evidence.
Yeah. Yeah, so one thing I did want to come back on that. I did hear this stated somewhere that there was a fire in the medieval times, and they had to, and part of the shroud was basically destroyed, and so they they took a piece of fabric and sewed it back on to complete it, and that's where they took that carbon dating from.
Are you
Is
talking
that
about
true?
the strip? Are you talking about the side strip?
Yeah.
So there's disagreement on that. There's some people that claim that that side strip was part of the original fabric. And I believe it's Adrie van der Hoeven. She's written a whole article saying that she thinks that it was something that was used by, I guess, the rabbis using that cloth, and that there's something where you're supposed to usually put a side strip. Some people question whether it was something that was Joseph of Arimathea's, but so the thing is, what we know, there are so many issues with the space that it was carbon dated from, but with the whole textile thing. So with the textiles, because we have a mountain of evidence that points in the direction of authenticity, and there's just, you know, the carbon dating that goes in the opposite direction.
Well, what about the 2013 or the 2018 study that argued the blood couldn't have come from Christ?
Okay.
That the wounds aren't they don't line up.
Right. So that was done with I believe his name was Matteo Borini and Luigi Garlaschelli. Shroud skeptics, but you know, that doesn't matter. Let's test it. So the problems with that is, you know, there are articles debunking the debunkers, and so problems with that are, first of all, they used. If you can even look, there's a video of them doing the experiment, and you can see how runny the blood is, because they've got an anticoagulant in it. So they've made it even runnier. And now let's think about Jesus. Was Jesus well hydrated when he was on the cross? No, he was extremely dehydrated. His body was under stress, which elicits different responses. They were on one of the ones with the side wound, they were using a mannequin. Well, a mannequin's body is totally smooth. So that blood was just, and plus they were using a blood bag and pouring lots of blood, of this thin, drippy stuff. So, you know, you got to do apples to apples. And that was most certainly.
Definitely sounds like apples and oranges there.
Yes, yes.
Okay, so yeah, that's you know, that's one of the things I do want to get into some positive evidence here, and maybe you can answer these questions for me. Hasn't there been recovered some first century Israeli pollen that these fibers actually have ingrained in it?
There's a ton of pollen evidence. To be really candid with you, I used to use that in my argumentation. Not that, I mean, this was a while back before I was getting into debates regarding the shroud, but I came across some information where it put it into question, the person that had collected the evidence, and I don't know what the situation is, whether it's, so it might be credible, and I kind of hate to even say anything bad because maybe that's just totally wrong. But what I want to do is I want to get the best, most solid evidence that I present, and not have something that's easy pickings for the skeptics. But in terms of that evidence, yeah, there's all sorts of things, lots of flora and fauna on the shroud that is consistent with Jerusalem. And
Yeah.
so it is impressive. And like I said, I used to go for, and it may still be true, but we've got bigger and better.
Yeah. How about the one where Habermas? He was on Unbelievable a while back. It was a long time ago, I think. Now I'm old, so but he was discussing the fact that there was some new evidence at that time that had come out where there seems to be some sort of radioactivity that went on to imprint that image. And yeah, I wanted to clarify that. Of course, I never looked into it like I wanted to, but
One of the, in terms of people recreating the image, the closest that I have seen has been done through radiation, and it's referred to as a corona discharge. And it gives you those same qualities, but not all the way. The reason why is it was done actually with I'm confusing the two. There's another one done with UV light with an excimer laser, but then the one that I saw a photo of was done. It was a coronal discharge, and but they needed a lot more power on that, I guess, to bring about the full feel of the shroud.
And corona, they're talking about corona like heat from the sun, right? I mean, they're talking about like a flash of sunlight that is so bright that it leaves that image.
Yeah, I mean, all I know is they refer to it as corona discharge, and I know when we had the eclipse, I wouldn't be able to give you any more detail on that, but I do know that I've seen the picture, and that is that even you start to see some of the skeletal aspects of, for example, like in the fingers, in the hands. It's just, it doesn't go, it goes maybe like, if the shroud image is at 100%, this takes it to about 75, but it looks to be the same process, just not as intense. But now the other thing is we don't know if it was some sort of supernatural energy, because just because radiation might give you the same or similar look doesn't mean that it was actually radiation. Maybe it was just a supernatural energy, but but all the other attempts at falsification or falsifying the shroud through using paint to paint the shroud, or powdered pigments, a hot statue to put scorch marks on those, all of those have failed miserably because they don't meet criteria in terms of the imaging that was done.
Yeah. And even if the guy was just a dead guy, I mean, there has to be more to it than that, just as a body being laid on because of the coagulation and so forth. So yeah, that's all that's all pretty interesting. And there's no putrefaction. That's really interesting too. And so yeah, go ahead. No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, because the third possibility, either it's a fake, it's the real deal, or it's just some random crucifixion victim, because it's very apparent from the image between the body image and the bloodstains that this is a crucifixion victim, or it's meant to look like a crucifixion victim. So one of the things, it's really irrational to think that that it's some random crucifixion victim that isn't Jesus, because one, crucifixion victims were typically criminals. Why? And the cloth, the shroud, is an extremely expensive. It's a very unique. Maybe unique is not. I mean, we don't know if another one exists, but it's a 3-to-1 herringbone weave. When they did the carbon testing back in 1988, they were looking for a control sample of a cloth, a linen cloth that had that weave. And Michael Tite of the British Museum could not, and think about all the ancient textiles he's got access to at the British Museum. They could not find anywhere a fabric with that weave. So that tells us that it was very rare. Now, why would a family of some random crucifixion victim, which is probably the black sheep of the family, why would they bury him in an extremely rare, expensive cloth? That doesn't quite make sense. But it does make sense for Jesus, because Joseph of Arimathea had gotten the cloth, and he was very wealthy. So it would make sense that that's how they came about the cloth.
Right.
Do y'all want any more information on why the carbon dating is bad?
Sure, go ahead. I mean, yeah, I was going to say, hey, do you have any other positive evidence that you want to put out to the audience before we wrap up? I mean, we got about 5 minutes, so.
Okay. Yes. So in terms of, because the biggest hypothesis is that the Shroud is a painting. Well, first of all, to have a painting, because Walter McCrone, who was a microscopist that kept saying that it's a painting, he was saying that it was a thinly diluted watercolor painting. But in order to have a painting, you have to have media, a binder to hold the paint to that. And also, this shroud had been through a fire, and water had hit the shroud. There are watermarks on the shroud. Now, if that body image was a painting done with watercolors, well, you can better believe it would be distorted, but it's not. And we don't see, if it was paint, you would see between the threads of the shroud, you would see accumulation of paint. We would call that cementation. The shroud also has 3D qualities when you put it through this machine called a VP8 image analyzer. When they put a photo of it, they then saw these 3-dimensional qualities to it, and you can't get that with just a painting. There's no evidence. The STURP team, they did a bunch of chemical tests. They did not find any pigment, any dye, any stain that could account for the image that they were seeing. And they were having to use all sorts of chemicals trying to get rid of the body image. And finally they found, I forgot the name of what chemical, finally, something really strong to remove the body image off of like one of the fibers that they were testing. Also, for an artist to have painted this, when you look at the shroud and you look at the perspective of it, it's like, because you got to imagine, given the anatomical accuracy of it, there's this famous artist, she's passed away, Isabelle Pixec, and she does very large scale paintings in human forms. And she was saying that when you look at the perspective for an artist to have gotten everything with the body, and remember, it's not just painting one body in proportion, you've got to paint two, because the shroud, it's like 14 feet long. You've got a frontal and a dorsal image. So they've got to make it perfect to where they line up. And she said that the perspective that an artist would need in order to have a model to use to create that, the model would need to be laying down. Also, the shroud shows that a man is in rigor mortis. So the model wouldn't be able to lay flat. They would have to be bent in the shape of a person who is crucified on the cross, because the form of the man on the shroud is, when you look at the body and how like the chest is protruding out and all, they had to dislocate the shoulders when burying him so as to fold his hands, and they may have already been dislocated because of hanging on the cross. But so Isabelle Pixec said that to paint the shroud, you would have to get about on a 15-foot high ladder for the artist, looking down on a model. Now, she also mentions when you look at the dorsal image of the shroud, you can tell that it's in rigor mortis, that Jesus is in rigor mortis, because there is no flattening of the buttocks. And actually, I think it was Gilbert Lavoie, Dr. Gilbert Lavoie, or somebody's done where they had a nude man laying on a piece of glass to where they can see, like, you know, what does the body look like? What would the imprint be? And of course, the buttocks would be flattened, and the back, the upper portion of the back would have a flattening effect. But that is not what you see on the shroud, because the body was kind of arched upward. And it would be probably next to impossible for some person to hold that awkward pose. And we see foreshortening with the image on the shroud. And that wasn't even a thing in art at that time. There's no artwork with crucifixion scenes and stuff that show the type of blood marks like what we see on the shroud. On the shroud, we also see with the crown of thorns. It's not a crown of thorns. All of the artwork shows like a circlet, like a thin wreath. With the shroud, we see a cap of thorns. And the way we know that is because of all of the little the puncture wounds from the thorns. And it goes all, no, we don't have an image of the tip top of the shroud because the cloth didn't cover the top of the head, but you can see where the puncture wounds go all the way up, higher than what a wreath would. So if somebody was going to forge an image of Jesus, they would do what people were used to seeing, which was a crown of thorns. Then there's the puncture wounds in the hand. In artwork, we usually see the puncture wounds, the nail wounds in the upper palm of the hand. In the shroud, no, actually what we're seeing in the shroud, it's an exit wound, not an entrance wound, but it is in the wrist. Why would an artist, if they're trying to fool everybody, put it in the wrist? You know, that would make no sense whatsoever. You've got, what other, there's no directionality or even outlines to the shroud. There are just so many different features. The color is the same all the way, because some people have thought maybe it's a scorch mark, like somebody got a metal statue, heated it up, and put a cloth around it. When people have tried to do that, you get a distorted image, and scorch marks fluoresce under UV light, whereas the shroud body does not.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, that's very interesting stuff. All of it's very interesting. David, do you have anything you would like to comment on here before we wrap?
No, I think that was all very good, very interesting. A lot to think about there for sure.
So, Teddi, we appreciate you coming on. We're going to wrap it up now. Is there any last word you want to say?
Yes, there is a ton more to.
Yeah.
I know that the show's wrapping up, but there is a ton of evidence concerning the shroud, and also even with the radiocarbon dating. And a friend of mine, Joe Marino, he has got a book that's getting ready to come out probably in a month or less, and that deals with all of the hinky things. The people that did the radiocarbon dating, there were all these protocols initially that they were supposed to follow, and they scrapped them all. And so, and one more thing, and this comes from the people that did the carbon dating. There's this thing called a chi-square test, which deals with reliability of the carbon date, and they themselves show that their test did not pass the chi-square test. So,
oh wow,
dating is garbage. But anyway, Joe Marino, be on the lookout.
It makes me wonder. They should try it again. But the bad thing is, I mean, it just destroys fabric.
Well, and it from the worst possible
part,
area.
yeah.
There's been a watermark, and water messes up radiocarbon dating.
Yeah.
Scorch mark, that carbon. And then there's a question as to whether there was an invisible reweave. And actually, Joe Marino and his late wife, Sue Benford, they have done a lot of research in the area of an invisible reweave to mend the cloth, because where they took the sample was where they were always holding up the shroud when they were displaying it countless times.
Huh.
So think of all the stuff.
Why didn't they just take it right out of the middle?
Yeah.
Right. But anyways, yeah, it's all very interesting. I mean, you've given us a lot to think about, and you've given the audience a lot to think about. I would love, like I said, for you to create an actual apologetic, like an actual argument, maybe a deductive argument of some sort that would fit within a cumulative case that people could present to atheists. I think that would be a great adventure that you could take part in.
That little by little, such a huge volume of evidence when it comes to the shroud. But one of the big things in terms of what you were talking about, a case, is Jesus made a falsifiable claim. He had said, I mean, there are many verses that talk about where he had mentioned that he was going to be dying, that people would betray him, that he was going to die, and that he was going to be resurrected. And so I consider the Shroud of Turin God's gift of evidence for the doubting Thomases, but also for everyone, because it's amazing to be able to look at the face of your Savior. And so I think that they've
been using it for years.
Yeah, and it's like I've never needed the shroud to believe in God, but it has deepened just the relationship when you can see, and also when you study it and you start to, when you look at what the forensic pathologists say, for what when they look at the wounds, what Jesus went through, it just gives you a whole new appreciation. Far more than Mel Gibson's movie.
Oh yeah, well that was a good movie. I still love that movie. But anyways, again, thanks so much for coming on. David, I'm going to kick it to you to wrap us up and tell us what we got coming up in the near future.
Yeah, well, just next week we've got a panel discussion going on, 5 views on apologetic methodology. We're all going to be hating on presuppositionalism. No, I'm kidding.
I thought that was 2 weeks from now.
No, yeah, sorry, you're right. Yes, that's in 2 weeks. We've got that panel discussion coming up, and so yeah, you'll want to turn out for that. It's going to get feisty, I'm sure, but it should be interesting. And if you're just new to apologetics and you're kind of, trying to figure out what exactly or how exactly you want to go about that, then it should be helpful to you there. And I think that's the only big announcement that I have to make.
Well, except that you want to do some new things with PORA Raw, which is
okay.
It's about that.
I didn't know we agreed on this. Okay,
I did agree on.
Okay.
Yeah, we can do that.
Okay, idea I had is there's a lot of Christian movies that come out these days, and most of them are really bad, but I used to like them back in the day, and I watched a lot of them. But anyway, so I was thinking, what if we did some movie reviews now of Christian movies, especially the apologetic themed ones, like God's Not Dead, A Matter of Faith, movies like that, and just kind of give our thoughts on, what could they have done better, what are maybe some good parts, and of course, we can think of the directions we want to take that, but that's something to look forward to on PORA Raw.
Yep. Right on. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, we are wrapped. Again, if you like this video, you can subscribe to our channel by just clicking the little watermark in the lower right-hand corner. This is David Russell and David Paulman with Teddi Pappas, and we are out of here.
Bye.